Thanks very much for inviting me, to Yannicka and Gary particularly. As you've already heard, I've recently taken over actually Mayfly Press, and we do have Armin Beverungen who's here and actually set Mayfly Press up, so he's probably in a better position to speak about the project than I am. Mayfly grew out of an online journal, Ephemera, which I set up with Campbell Jones and Stefan Bohm in 2001. Our first issue was published. That's still going, so the original term, calling it ephemera, was the idea that this would actually be probably quite short-lived, and like many websites might just disappear and be lost in the ether somewhere, but some 15 years later is actually still going quite strong, so took on a little bit more solidity. The idea of Mayfly, of course, was that they die in a day and have a relatively short life cycle. So again, sort of playing with this idea of digital and immaterial. But we actually do publish also material books. So like Joe was just talking about, actually sort of wanting to produce the material, tangible artifact that we kind of invest quite effectively in, I think, as academics wanting to produce books. Although the press has started in 2005, it's actually had a little bit of a hiatus recently, so no books have come out for a short period of time, and we've recently relocated to Leicester, which is why I've taken on from Armin, trying to kind of reboot, in a sense, the press. So I have to admit, one of my reasons for being here is to get a lot of ideas for how to kind of really develop that, and compared to the kind of enormous list of contributors and members that Joe has just presented for Matterings, this is basically at the moment Armin and Stefan still in a kind of a consulting role, me and Franzi, who's also at the back, Franziska Dalmeyer, who's working as a GTA a day a week on the project. So we haven't got quite the sort of same material resources of people to go at it. But what I want to do before I talk much about the press is actually just put a little bit of context on here. And think about the book as an artifact. And I'm just going to tell a little story. Does anybody know Glasgow Caledonian? Okay, this is Glasgow Cali's library, which, if you can see, has nice little inflatable bubbles that students can go and sit in to check Facebook or something. It has breakout areas, lots of computer areas, cafes, and very few books. Right, there's almost no books, and those that are there are on these short little stacks that you can move along. So there's a relatively small amount of books. This was almost a kind of a post-print resource. This is where I used to work before moving to Leicester in January. It's Essex Business School, and that's the new building. And one of the big battles that we had with the people in estates when we were planning for that was over bookshelf space, right? Because they didn't give us very much bookshelf space. And when we actually had a meeting with the department, where the director of estates came along, when people started to talk about books, his comment was, well, for those of you who are still living in the Tudor times and may actually want printed books, then, we'll provide you with 2 meters of shelf space. However, most people nowadays are working in the digital environment. So there was this assumption that actually we're moving away from printed. So it might seem a little bit strange to be looking at the books in a printed context in today's day and age, at least in certain mindsets. So what I want to do is to start really then to think about what the book is and the point of it, but in a very specific context, in the context of critical management studies, the discipline that I'm based in and that we're mostly speaking to with Mayfly books. So I have a quote from Yannicka and Gary's article that they quoted earlier. The medium of the book remains subject to a number of constraints in terms of its material form, structure, characteristics and dimensions, and also in terms of the political economies, institutions and practices in which it's historically embedded. Consequently, if it is to continue to be able to serve new ends as a medium through which politics itself can be rethought, although this is still a big if, then the material and cultural constitution of the book needs to be continually reviewed, re-evaluated and reconceived. So what I want to do very quickly is to talk a little bit about actually the political, economic and the institutional context within CMS. Right, first and foremost, I guess probably most people here, if you're here for a radical open access conference, are aware of this, so I apologise if this is too obvious, but I think it's perhaps worth restating. Why would we be interested in, as I would see it, taking control back over publishing, using the opportunities that open access affords us as academics? Well, one is the sheer profiteering. We're looking at profit margins in the range of operating profit margins over 40% for some publishers. Okay, certainly 20 to 30% is not unusual in journal publishing, which is a phenomenal rate of profit that is being made basically on the back of, as Joe's already talked about with reviewers, I would actually suggest a triple expropriation of academic labour. We not only do the research, and the writing of our research, usually funded by public money or by our students' fees. We also do all of the reviewing and the editing, quite often for free, particularly in journals, but also for book series and a range of different things. And then finally, we actually buy the things back, right? When our own library budgets are the ones that are used to bring back the things that we have produced and that otherwise we'd be breaching copyright to give even to our own students. I've often wondered what it is that the publishers actually do, and I mean, I know Armin's got a bit more of a positive take on this, but it seems like the two main things are marketing, which is increasingly devolved. If any of you have published a journal article recently, you'll probably get from the publisher actually a list of what you should be doing to market your own research publications. You know, make sure you promote this on Facebook and on Twitter and go out and do this. So even the marketing is being devolved back to us as academics. So what they mostly seem to do is actually stop people accessing the work that you've written without paying for it, maintaining those kinds of firewalls and limiting those forms of access. Now, we know that the publishers are embracing the gold road to open access publishing through the pay to publish and maintaining those things, and maintaining their profits by author processing charges, article processing charges, book processing charges now as well, to maintain those kinds of things. So I think we've got an interesting discussion that will probably be coming on over the course of the next 2 days in that. So that's one of the contexts, political, economically. Institutionally, I think it's also important to, in the context of the United Kingdom at least, to look at the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which certainly has led in the area of business and management studies to the domination by journals. So in my discipline, it's almost not appropriate to write books anymore. We've been told we should be writing articles, and we should be writing those for journals that are ranked. We have the Association of Business Schools list, which lists journals on a 1 to 4, 4 being the best. You're only really supposed to publish in 4 journals or 4-star journals, which are mostly North American journals in business and management studies at least. Now, those serve a certain function when you have pro-vice chancellors of research that are ignorant about the diversity of the kind of research that they might be putting a submission to the REF panel for. It stands as a surrogate of quality that they can use to judge whether somebody's work is good. If you take just a business school context, our director of research is from cultural studies, but he has to be able to evaluate the work of somebody who's doing econophysics and quantitative finance without knowing anything about that particular discipline. So they can use this as a way of evaluating the quality of work that they're actually completely ignorant of, right? By putting a 1 to 4 against it and using that as a surrogate. Now, there are a whole range of problems with how those kinds of things operate, but I think it's part of the institutional context that we're dealing with. It also creates a problem of institutional credibility. So this is obvious for journals. When we set up Ephemera, actually establishing that this was an appropriate place to send your work was a really big challenge, because everybody was being told they should only be submitting to the 3- and 4-star journals, but we weren't ranked. It took a long time to get that kind of, even to get a ranking at level 1 on that. And it seems to be biased. It's quite opaque as to exactly how those rankings are calculated, although the chief editor's own journal, of course, is a 4. So there's which is quite an interesting one. So there's that. And I think the same thing happens then with books. So in the recent REF, at least in our area, the very few books that were submitted were often taken as a double submission. They were double weighted where they were really excellent. And actually it's carved out a space where people can start publishing books and submitting them to the REF. And that's maybe an interesting space that this might open up for that. But again, we've got this kind of question of how do we determine what's appropriate and how do we get the kind of credibility? If something's published with MIT Press, okay, that's got an institutional credibility. If something's published with Mayfly, is it a good book? Is it not? So we have to address this issue of how individual careers, I think, are shaped. And one of the biggest challenges that we've got at the moment is actually getting the books in, to get people to commit to putting their work and investing it in a relatively unknown, small-scale, independent publisher. If they're going to write a book, they tend to want to go for Stanford University Press, MIT or something. Okay, so this is a quote that was from a book series that we're trying to work on establishing at the moment in valuation studies. And I just want to put this was from an email discussion that we had about the strategies for developing the kind of press and taking it forward. And this was from one of our prospective editors from this book series. I'm a bit sceptical with regard to edited collections. Given the pressure in the UK and elsewhere to publish in journals, I think that edited collections face a quality problem. Academics will be very reluctant to submit good quality articles to an edited collection. Emerging scholars are also increasingly advised not to waste their work in book chapters. I've heard that advice being given in several PhD workshop sessions on publishing, not only by mainstream, but also by critical management and accounting scholars. Now, this is for somebody whose career is built on critical evaluation studies and unsettling the very idea of creating league tables and how you can quantify quality. Okay, but is recognizing nevertheless that this is a kind of almost like Mark Fisher talks about, a capitalist realism sort of argument, right? That's the reality of the game that we're playing here. Nobody's going to write book chapters. And certainly in interviews with at my previous institution, with our research director there, I was actually told to take book chapters off my CV in terms of my annual appraisal format, because you're not really supposed to be doing that. That's just wasting your time and it looks bad. You should only be submitting to these 4-star journals. So I think we've got an interesting issue here. Now, one of the perversities, of course, that comes out of that we're hoping to work with edited collections to address is that actually the lead time on a lot of the special issues for journals is huge. So I recently published a paper in a journal, Organisation Studies, that was based on a conference that took place in 2010. By the time the special issue had been commissioned, publicised, reviewed 6 different times with various revise and resubmit, and finally made it through to publication, that took 5 years to publish, okay, because of the logjam that's created in these 4-star journal articles. So I actually think we've got an opportunity to get more timely publications with more control, rather than going through these journals that might be open. But nevertheless, these are the kinds of institutional barriers. So if you've got ideas to deal with that, that'd be really helpful. When we come to books, I think we've got similar kind of perversities. This is a book I recently co-edited, and reluctantly published with Taylor Francis of Routledge. It's the Handbook of Alternative Organisations. We've got a whole bunch of stuff in there on gift economies, on scrounging, on reclaiming, on squatting, on workers' cooperatives. And if you want to find out about how to do all of those things, you can stump up 140 quid for a hardback edition. And unless we sell 500 of those, they won't go to paperback. Okay, if you actually want a copy, I will send you the proofs. Just email me about them. But that gives you an idea of the kind of stuff that is supposedly cutting-edge critical, right? And mea culpa, I'm involved in it as well. But another one, hardcover, 85, paperback, $29.99 for a critical management research handbook, edited collection, or a textbook, more of a monograph approach, £30+. We know the costs for producing at that kind of quality in paperback are nowhere near there. So that's also an ethical question, I think, in terms of the care of the readership. If you're expecting students, but also if this is not just complete self-indulgent dilettantism, writing this kind of research, then we want somebody to read it, and they're not going to read it at that unless they have a university library subscription. Okay, so the kind of challenges that we're seeing then in terms of institutionalizing open access, I mean, Yannicka and Gary have already flagged some of these sorts of things up with the Finch report and the shift from the green to the gold, that kind of debate over there. If we look at the kind of costs, journal article charges would be in the region of 1,800. Palgrave Open, 1,600 for if you want to optionally put your journal article in a subscription journal open access so that people can access it. We recently looked at De Gruyter Open for a monograph of a decent size, an academic monograph. You're talking about €10,000 to publish that. There's quite a lot of money involved in this, given that, again, an awful lot of the work of writing, proofreading, editing, even indexing is going to be borne in large part by the authors for many of these kinds of things, not entirely. Although De Gruyter very kindly do provide a handy list of funding sources, so you can actually apply to get public funding in order to subsidise their profit rate, which is, I think, very magnanimous of them. Okay, so that's the kind of the context institutionally and politically, economically that we're working in, I think, here. So I've already talked about ephemera a little bit. We have done 9 books so far, plus we regularly publish the print versions of ephemera's publications. So there's quite a catalogue there of those. They're all available through Lightning Source on print on demand. We also put PDFs online free for download. Ephemera's already free for that. In terms of the institutional support, we have managed to get a little bit of support from Leicester University to cover this. So Franziska's working as a GRA on a PhD program with a day a week tagged to the Mayfly project to work on that. And then I give my labour freely because there's no workload model that will take account of that, although that's an ongoing kind of battle that we're having within the university about how to recognise reviewing and editing work. And they do provide some kind of training and software support. But when it comes to getting the material resources in to pay for things like professional proofreading, design work or something, we need to talk to you, Joe, about where to get some funding for that kind of stuff, because we are going to be tapping into public sources and then channeling that kind of thing into that, I think, as we go forward. In terms of our strategy, we're trying to go for sort of a 3x3 model. So print-on-demand paperbacks at a very reasonable price. They're around about £10 to £12. It varies on size, but sometimes up to 15. So it's relatively cheap. We have free online PDFs at the moment that you can just download from the website. What I would like to do is to develop some of the more formatted, user-friendly ebook reader versions where you can tap on, the hyperlinks for the references and have it slightly more user-friendly and maybe charge £2 or £3 in that region. I think most, at least academics, would be prepared to pay for that, and that might offer an alternative revenue stream as well. Then traditional monographs, edited collections and reprinted classics. The book that's actually sold the most has been a reprinted version of Marcuse's Negations. So that's where we're at. Obviously that reprinting raises copyright issues as well that would be good to get some expertise on. So that's the Mayfly project. Thanks.